Professor Mark Maney, no, just Mark Fregeau and Ted Maney, apologize, from Salem State. Who will be talking to us today about their research. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, good morning. As introduced, I am Mark Fregeau. This is my colleague Ted Maney. We are from Salem State University, which is in Salem, Massachusetts, on the North Shore. And among my various responsibilities is to run the Cove Marine Laboratory, which is what you see here on the screen right now. In addition to being a marine lab, we are also an aquaculture center. Massachusetts has set up 3 state centers for aquaculture, and we are the Northeastern, or NEMAC, as we're better known, dealing with aquaculture at the state level throughout the Commonwealth. And this is my lab, Cat Cove. It has actually been around since the early 70s, but my institution took it over in the mid-90s when we renovated it into a complete marine lab. I was fortunate. I was actually part of the design team that organized the lab, and I'm now the person that supposedly is in charge. Well, I'm never quite sure about that at times. What makes our lab really unique is the back of the property. There is a 7.5 acre tidal pond. Has a dam that separates us from the harbor, and we have complete control of the pond and the water level within it. It was built as a swimming pool back in the early 1900s. Today, you couldn't do this. Environmental laws, you'd never get approval. But it was built long before those laws were enacted, and we actually can use it for our research. So we have our own piece of ocean that is basically the same environment as out in the harbor. Temperature, salinity, and so forth are the same, but it's under our control. We have a set of tidal gates. That's the harbor right beyond there. Salem is a very large harbor, and we control the gates. So we can actually flush the pond. We can drain it if we really want to. Normally, we just have it open a little bit so we get a nice tidal flush. Inside, I have a seawater system. I can distribute tempered water, everything from low 30s up to almost 80 degrees if I wanted to, into a series of tanks. We have over 40 tanks in our lab, ranging from about 40 to 50 gallons up to about 500 gallons of water. So we can do that. Mostly seawater. It's all filtered, sterilized before it comes in. But we also do have some freshwater systems. So we're able to move back and forth as we need to. Our primary charge is to raise soft-shell clams. We are the only state shellfish hatchery in Massachusetts. In fact, we're one of the only ones in New England. In fact, the other big hatcheries up here in Maine, out in Beals Island. Soft-shell clams, which are steamers, for those of you who are more on the eating side of things, are the main clam around this area, throughout New England until you get really down to Cape Cod. For us, it's what we call the Ipswich clam, fairly well known in feeding areas. And since I heard you're dealing with invertebrates right now, I happen to teach invertebrate zoology along with Professor Maney, and I happen to work particularly on mollusks, not surprising, working with clams. And you should know, if you haven't found out already, that most of your shellfish, at least, are filter feeders. And they consume various algae. This is our algal room, where we have various forms of algae that we feed our clams as they are going through their life cycle. So we have several different kinds of algae that we culture and keep going throughout the year. In fact, it kind of looks like one of those alien shows sometimes with the algae bubbling up in our cylinders. Here are my principal residents. These are our adult breeding clams. We have approximately 40 adult clams. In case you're not up on your clam biology, Maya, which is the soft-shell clam we work with, come in separate sexes, male and female. And while they may be able to tell who is who, you cannot. The only way you can really sex a clam is to open them up and actually examine the gonadal material, something they prefer not to have you do. So we get around it by having many of them. Usually we put about 30 or 40 in a tank at a time, and we figure that probability there'll be at least one male and one female. And as they release their gametes into the water, we're able to get a good spawn. If you notice, they seem to be in their own little cases there. We found very early on in our work that if we simply put clams in a tank and let them sit there, they did not grow very well. The shell became malformed, the muscle structure was not very well developed, and what we realized after a time is normally they live in sediment, and the pressure of the sand against them actually has an effect on their muscle and shell development. And we didn't want to put sand in our tank because that gets into the filters and causes problems. My lab tech tells me about it in rather detailed ways. So this is our alternative. We put them in these small containers, sometimes just a rubber band, gives them pressure against the shell, and they actually develop much more readily. So we actually bring our clams in usually in February. They tend to spawn locally for us usually in April or May, depending on water temperature. We fool them. We adjust the water temperature early, give them a quick shock, warm them up, then cool them off again, and they think it's May, even though the calendar doesn't say that. Fortunately, clams cannot read calendars, so get them to spawn early. Happens to be my lab technician. He actually really does true animal husbandry because he's in there weekends all the time looking at all his clams, making sure that everything is going well. Soft-shell clams, once they spawn, they produce a swimming larvae, a veliger larvae, which is in the water column for approximately 10 days, 14 days, depending on water temperature. They then settle to the bottom, they go through a metamorphosis and start forming a small little clam that would look more like the clam that you're familiar with. What Scott's doing there is actually doing some sorting. Clams are still individuals. They have their own growth properties, and some grow faster than others. So we periodically sort them so that we keep clams that are roughly growing at the same rate together in their own cohort and keep them separate in terms of the growth process. Because we want to get them to about 10 millimeters before they leave our lab building. When you first see them, we actually have them on window screen, and you barely can see them. They look like tiny little specks of sand. Okay, here's what Scott's actually working with, some of our clams, separating them into different groups. These are probably been in the lab for about a month. They tend to grow pretty quickly in the lab because, of course, we take good care of them. We give them plenty of food so that they're able to grow very quickly. Okay. Once we get them to about the size you just saw them, we move them out of the lab. This is actually our intermediate building on our pond where we keep them. And we have a series of tanks in here with running seawater. This water doesn't get filtered. The difference being that we now start switching them over to feeding off of the algae within the natural system, rather than the algae that we are raising in the lab. So this is what they're going to have to survive on. And for us, it's a lot less work, it's a lot cheaper. We just constantly run new seawater in. They'll stay in here perhaps a month or so, depending on how things are growing. And then we move them down onto our dock. Our dock is actually set up as an upweller. You can actually see over on this side here that it opens up. And there's a series of silos down there, little motor that keeps the water running. And this is where they're going to stay until we're ready to move them out. It's really nice because you can get to them, do whatever work you need, but then you can close the door down, use it as a regular dock, keeps the birds and some of the other predators from getting at them. but they're still contained, so we can manage them very well. They stay here until they're about 14 to 16 millimeters in size. That's the optimum in terms of putting them out in the field. We can keep them longer than that if we have a need to, but that's usually when they go out. And this is what we do with them. We supply clams to the state, we apply to towns, and to individual growers. As long as you have the permits that are required by the state, you can get clams from us for a nominal fee. Once you get your clams, get your appropriate flat, put them on, do a little bit of raking, break up the ground a little bit. Not completely unlike growing corn. And in fact, we call it seeding. It happens to be a flat up in Ipswich, preparing it. Once we seed them, and basically it's broadcasting across the open area, and we cover them with nets that have small floats in them. And this is where they'll stay until they get to about 55, 60 millimeters or so in size, around 2 inches or so, and of course become legal. And then they can be harvested. For where we live, 12, 14 months, depending on exactly what time of year they go out and what the water temperature is. Up here, probably be another couple months added to that, because your waters tend to get a little bit colder than ours. And this is what you might end up with. You got a nice adult clam. If you happen to be up in the Gloucester area, which is the big fishing town near us, there are plenty of nice restaurants where you can go and see what they get turned into. I'm a firm believer, if you're going to do research in biology, it's nice to do work that you can end up eating when you're done. It kind of makes everything a little bit more worthwhile. And this is what we do. We've been producing clams since 2000, and this is actually our record up till now. So we're up to close to 37 million soft-shell clams that we have produced over the course of the last 14 years. Pretty nice build up here. We're kind of at around 3 million or so now. We could easily ramp that up if the need was really out there. Right now we deal mostly with Massachusetts. We've been dealing a little bit with the state of New York. We've dealt with Connecticut, and there's a possibility, we're still kind of working on things, that things may come up here into Maine as well. We're working with some people down in the Freeport area. It's about an hour, I think, south of you, roughly. One of the big issues that people are always concerned about is making sure that things were healthy, especially when you start crossing state lines, and making sure that you are obeying the state regulations. Every state's a little different in terms of how they enforce things. And we do have health inspections for our clams twice a year. We send them out to an independent lab where they get certified that they're not contaminated or something else. Just in case you're not into Massachusetts, this is roughly where we have been doing our work. Most of the coast and even down onto Nantucket. Most of the places you see that are not included, especially up in this area, that's the Boston area. And most of the areas there are very limited in terms of being able to be used because you're dealing with all the pollution that's been there. And that's a problem with a shellfish, like a clam. They live in the bottom, in the sediments. That's where a lot of your contaminants accumulate, and they biomagnify whatever they take in. So whatever the toxin levels might be, metals, whatever the case may be, they're going to magnify it. And certainly you do not want to eat that. And unfortunately around Boston, some of the other older cities in Massachusetts, they've had a lot of time to contaminate their sediments. A lot of industrial work and so forth. We're actually doing a little work now in the southern part of Boston Harbor, what's called the Outer Harbor, where some of the towns have actually started to come back. And they are now able to support clams, and we're working with the Commonwealth to try to repopulate. We're even down on Cape Cod. Cape Cod is actually more oyster and hard shell clams, but they've started to go into soft shell. one of the big advantages in terms of cultured shellfish, soft shell clams tend to have fewer disease issues than hard shell and particularly oysters. Oysters are really problematic if you are culturing them. They get a lot of nasty diseases, ones that can easily pass on to you. Added to the fact that a lot of people eat oysters raw, so you don't even have the cooking issue coming in to help sterilize out the material. So if you're an oyster grower, you've got a lot of people watching you between the state, Board of Health, and so forth. But this is some older data, but just to give you some idea of just how rapidly clam growth can be once they get into an appropriate environment. And you can see that you get a really nice growth curve here. They would eventually straighten out, level off, I should say, and come to a plateau. Not really an issue with our clams because usually we've taken them out and eaten them before that would ever happen. But they're a very nice, consistently growing organism. A problem, and I think maybe you have mentioned it, perhaps in your class, certainly here in Maine, but also down where we are, is this guy. This is a green crab, which in the clamming world is about as bad as you can get. This is considered to be one of the more important predators of clams. They love to eat clams. And it's actually them in particular that we net our clam beds to try to keep them out until clams get big enough where they are less likely to be preyed upon. Even in nature, when clams first settle out on a bed, they're usually extremely small and they're in huge aggregations sometimes. I've seen natural sets where you can have several millimeters just thick with baby clams, and green crabs will come in and wipe them out. A clam has really only two defenses against a predator. It has the shell, especially as the clam gets bigger, the shell gets bigger and thicker, but its other defense is the dig. The deeper it can get into the sediment, because these guys don't really go down that deep usually, you get a chance that you might get a refuge. And a clam's ability to dig down in the sediment is proportional to its size. Little clams, they're pretty much right at the surface or right below it. The bigger clams, they get deeper. And if a clam gets big enough, then you have to get a really large green crab before they can do a whole lot to them anyways. What we run into sometimes with our more established beds, green crabs come in, they start biting off the siphons for the clams, which is important for their respiration and water flow, but they have trouble getting the whole clam itself. Up here in Maine, depending on who you talk to, you could put out wanted posters. Actually, I think they have put out wanted posters for this. Up here in Maine, there is an ongoing discussion as to whether the clamming industry in Maine will continue. And from what I know, with the exception of maybe lobsters, clams are huge in terms of the fisheries here in Maine, at least marine fisheries. Clams are really, for some people, considered to be in serious trouble. I've been in touch with people down in the Freeport, Brunswick area. Their clam beds have actually had no set at all this year. Not because there aren't clams out there, but as soon as they set, they're just supposedly destroyed. In Massachusetts, they've actually allocated from the state over $100,000 to get rid of green crabs. And most of it is going to go to local towns for people to trap them. And for the fishermen at least, all they want to do is trap them and get rid of them. They are an invasive. Good example of what invasive creatures can do when they come to a new place. Although the first reports are early 1800s, more immediate or more consistent sightings mid-1800s, and certainly going into the 1900s, they are known to be down in New Jersey, mid-Atlantic states, all the way up into Canada. Very wide distribution. And We can take a look here. Originally, we find them on the west coast of Europe, but we can see over time where they've expanded to. Most likely, this is a classic example of larval crabs in ballast water being transported by ships around the world. Ships, they take on ballast water as they go out to sea to stabilize themselves. When they come into port, they dump it. In fact, in this country, there are now more and more regulations that are trying to regulate that. But in the case of the green crab, it's pretty much already happened. So, you want to learn about green crabs? One way to do it is just go out and catch them. They can build a green crab trap, or you can use a minnow trap. They're not particularly picky, and just throw some dead fish or something in it. They're not really fussy about that either. They are very easy to get. And that's what people have been doing. Going out, trapping them, bringing them back, doing measurements, sexing them, checking to see what condition they're in terms of their limbs. And this is where aquaculture, which is a very applied area of biology, is really an interesting cooperation between people out there who are fishing, who are often not trained scientists, sometimes they're not all that interested in science, and actual researchers. You can never underestimate the actual fishermen, because they are incredibly valuable assets. They know the environment that they work in, they know the organisms, they know how to survive out in the environment, which for researchers is sometimes challenging to say the least. They may need a little bit of help into how you collect data, how you record it. With green crabs, they're not terribly interested, is this a male or a female? They just know it's a green crab. But we're working with them to try to get them to help us, because they're out in the field all the time. We can't always get out there and try to get some information. So in the last 10 years in particular, there have been a lot of trapping studies. I've actually done one down in my area. There's some up here where you just trap green crabs and you get some information, kind of get a population study or an overview of what's out there. So you get more of an idea of what's going on. So here we have our male and female green crab. Here's our female. We have this large pouch here, which actually can open up, and this is where she would keep her eggs. Very distinctive. Oop, lost one. Where'd he go? Compared to the male green crab, which has a very, very distinctive look to him. So we've collected data over the years. Wrong one. And we've seen, and this is Massachusetts, Maine would be slightly different because conditions are slightly different, of course. A fairly repeatable trend here. You tend to get your temperature, obviously, as you're getting towards this time of year, starting to decrease. You have the green crab population starting, depending on water temperature, sometime in the spring, but really starting to accumulate right about now. This is when they've really gotten out there, had a chance to really develop. Temperature, of course, is going to bottom out as you get into the winter. Then as temperature starts to increase, you have a bit of a delay here, but then the green crabs are going to do basically the same thing. So we can track the populations. And this is important, not only in terms of management, but understanding the green crab. We had about a 3-hour ride up here this morning, so we were discussing a little bit of theories that are out there right now. A lot of people think that green crabs in the winter obviously don't seem to be very active once the winter really sits in. Trying to decide what happens to them. Right now, a lot of people think that if you have a really cold winter, green crabs don't do very well. It hurts them. There's one theory out there, and we don't quite go with this, but that they go out to deep water and somehow get through the winter by staying out really deep water. Chances are, from what we've seen, that's not the case. What they do is they may go a little deeper, but they tend to burrow into the sediments. In river systems, they tend to burrow into the riverbank. If it gets really cold, that may hurt them a little bit. A lot of people up here in Maine and Massachusetts as well were really encouraged this past spring because the green crabs didn't come out quite as quickly this year. They didn't come out in quite the numbers. Because last year, as you probably know, we had a cold winter. Once the green crabs started coming out, this turned out to be a really banner year for green crabs. It just took them a while. What I think is probably more the case, it's not just the cold, but it's when you get ice, particularly when you have river systems. Cold may bother them. It may slow them down. It may kill some. Ice, I think, is really important, particularly in a river, because the ice, as it connects and starts to break up and so forth, you get scouring. And the crabs, which tend to go into the river banks, they get displaced, and if they're not killed directly, then they get exposed. And either way, you get rid of them. So a little bit of a question there as to what might be going on. But irregardless, here's just a typical set of data that's been collected over some time looking at green crab growth. They have a tremendous growth potential. And that's one of the reasons that they can be a real problem. You can find them on sandy bottoms, find them on rocky areas, you can find them in flats, tidal flats, salt marsh, that sort of thing. You can find them in all kinds of habitats. So they are, as it turns out, to be really good. One of my students who's currently doing a project can't see it real well, but if you look at the smaller claw there, actually he's got one of my clam seeds. We got involved in the study there. Things are, once they show up, they can be a real problem. My concern, though, is that so much of this is based on trapping data. I'm now trying to look at just doing regular surveys. Because if you throw bait out, you can collect all kinds of things in large numbers. But is that really an indicator of what's going on? Because you are attracting them. And of course, it's going to give you some overall numbers, you get some size distributions, but it may not be the true picture of what is happening. For example, we notice in trapping, you don't get gravid females with eggs. Because from what little I've seen from field observations, gravid females, once they get their eggs, they basically, until they're ready to release them, they just hunker down. They don't feed much, they go into seclusion. If they get into a trap, the first thing that happens is the other 50 crabs in that same trap are going to knock off every single egg from her body, just because of the way that they move, attack each other, and so forth. So trapping alone is not going to give you a complete picture of the population. You're going to lose a fair amount of the female, the adult female representation. So you've got to keep that in mind. While he's not a green crab, since my kids grew up with SpongeBob, I brought Mr. Krabs in here. Question is, can we do something with this? Can we do something with green crabs that might have a profit to them? Which is something we are looking at right now. And there seems to be a few possibilities. Massachusetts, we're looking at making them bait. We have a very big whelk industry in southern Massachusetts. Check you all out, whelks are another mollusk. Got a snail-like creature, with your inverts there. They used, in the past, horseshoe crabs as bait. Horseshoe crabs, really, really neat organism. Sometimes called a living fossil. They are somewhat endangered these days, so using them for bait really doesn't seem too good. Green crabs, on the other hand, there seems to be a lot of them, and we don't want them. Not maybe a bad idea. They've been used for fertilizer. Grind them up, maybe use them there. Maybe use them for food. There's an initiative in Brunswick right now, an individual who thinks he's got a process where he can take a green crab, grind it up into a paste, and you could serve it for an hors d'oeuvre. Put it on your bread. Sounds really tasty. The problem is that it only works well if you get a soft green crab. So you've got to figure out when they molt, because right after they molt is when they have the softest exoskeleton. And there are people in Europe, in Italy in particular, who have learned how to predict molting. They can do it by looking at the changes in color of the shell. The problem is, because people from around here have gone over here to learn this, problem is that they will tell you, oh, sure, you can tell because you look at them and you see. It's not the kind of technology you can transfer. People have learned it over years of living around the crabs and working in the industry. They can't tell you an actual protocol. So I guess you could go and live in Italy for a couple of years, maybe not a bad thing, or you could hire some Italians to come over here and tell you what's going on. But other than that, it's not something that we can really do with. Massachusetts, we've got a bounty out right now. As they say, they're actually paying the fishers in various communities to go out and trap them. So a really interesting question here. Another question though, with green crabs is how they affect other habitats, such as eelgrass. The paper I just came across from Marine Biology, actually early this year it came out, talking about just how devastating green crabs can be. This is actually a bed off of St. Lawrence Seaway, Nova Scotia. And I'm going to stop and let my colleague here talk a little bit, because he does eelgrass. I stay away from it, pretty much.
My work is usually underwater. My specialty is underwater research. So in addition to doing some things at Cat Cove, and we'll also get into our mussel aquaculture that we do, I have some students working with me, and we are surveying an eelgrass bed right near the Marine Lab at Salem. And this eelgrass bed is actually not on the state maps, so it's an uncharted eelgrass bed. It's now been charted. And we've been looking at over the last 2 years, just doing survey work. And there's actually an international survey protocol, SeagrassNet, where groups of researchers and even citizen scientists can go out and survey. There's an international standard protocol for surveying eelgrass beds. And there's obviously a lot of eelgrass beds up here in Maine, from the intertidal area to shallow subtidal. And again, with this whole green crab phenomenon, Crabzilla as I refer to it, there's this recent prediction that the green crabs are also knocking off the eelgrass beds. We're not seeing this in Massachusetts at all. In fact, we've been doing surveys inside and outside the eelgrass beds, and the green crabs are outside. And the bed we're studying extensively in Salem, so far this summer we've seen a green crab inside the bed. But obviously, they can get into that area, they can burrow in that area, they're gonna impact the eelgrass itself. But in general, I don't necessarily believe this study, and certainly in a particular area, they can be responsible for a lot of the damage. But eelgrass beds are being disturbed by lots of other impacts. Just anchoring and mooring of boats, just fishing activity. Invasive tunicates are smothering them. This summer in our eelgrass beds, is that what we have for the next line?
Space bar.
So here's eelgrass. This is one of the students doing the work, the survey work. So the seagrass protocol, you basically go out and you're looking at growth over time, you're looking at density, and you're looking at the shore edge, the middle of the bed, and the deep edge of the bed. And we've been looking at, last summer we were looking at the impacts of invasive tunicates. This summer, the tunicates haven't come. So when the invasive tunicates come on, they actually grow over the grass. So they actually are smothering the grass, and you see some die off because of that. This year what happened is there was big macroalgae blooms. So kelps, and then there's a invasive red algae that gets into everything and grows on things. And what happens is when you get the storms, the kelps and things get ripped up, and they've been washed inshore, and they've been laying across and getting entangled in the eelgrass and actually smothering big patches of the eelgrass bed. So different impacts, different years. One of the reasons for establishing a thing like seagrass net is you're going out year in and year out and doing these surveys. So over time, a lot of these research things require long time research and monitoring to see what the impacts are. So with the crab invasions and disruption of eelgrass, again, that's something maybe 1 year or one event, but the next year it may not be an event going on. So there's a real need for doing a lot of baseline and long-term type research. And these are activities that you have a marine biology club. How many people are divers, scuba divers? Right? Or snorkelers, right? Seagrass, eelgrass beds are in shallow water, so you can actually do these surveys snorkeling, right? Other things that I'm involved with, there's a citizens group called Reef that does fish and invertebrate surveys, and you can go online to reef.org and get their information, and again, you can do it diving or snorkeling. And the point of that is we have divers go out and make their dives, and if we can get them to fill out surveys, we can actually cover large areas. And for the Northeast region, I was actually part of the group that introduced invertebrate, but we also put in some algae and we put eelgrass in, because one of the things we want to do is have people identify where the eelgrass beds are. So a lot of the eelgrass surveys are done, they're aerial surveys, so if it's nice and clear, you can actually see the grass, but there's a lot of areas where you can't. So what we're finding out in Massachusetts is we're finding a lot more eelgrass beds in places that they are not listed as being there. So in Massachusetts, right now, they're saying that over the last 25 years, there's been a decrease in eelgrass, and I'm actually diving in other places and finding eelgrass in places that we haven't seen before. So again, it depends on where you're looking and how you're looking. So I'm a big proponent of sticking your head in the water and looking. And a lot of this underwater research is addressing some of these things. Same with the green crab stuff. A lot of it is speculation, and until we actually get out there and do some quantitative surveys, all we're relying on is the trap studies, and then also, like in the clamming thing, we know they're there in the clam flats, but we don't really have a handle of their population and their dynamics, right? And the impacts. And nobody goes out in the winter to see what's going on, right? So that's why there's this misconception that things go into the deeper water. Well, by deeper water, yeah, they may go out of the intertidal range, but most of the time they're burrowed down and they're not moving around because it's cold, right? These are all cold-blooded animals. So when the water gets cold, when it gets below mid-30s, everything's hunkered down. And when I dive and do surveys in the midwinter, we still see everything still there, but it's just not moving around. So, mussels. In addition to the clam hatchery, Mark and myself have been doing mussel aquaculture. Mussel aquaculture is done out in the ocean, and essentially, do we have a line here?
We do.
We hoist it from the boat, but here's a typical mussel longline culture setup, right? 90% of the mussels that you buy in a restaurant or buy in a store here are not U.S. product, right? 90% of the product is coming from Canada. And this is a billion-dollar, multi-billion-dollar industry. And we, in Massachusetts, started to see if we could apply this in Massachusetts coastal waters. There is aquaculture going on in Maine coastally. These lines are under a raft, so they call it raft culture, and that's because of the ducks, the diving ducks, that if you had an unprotected line out in the coast and a raft of eider ducks found it, they would pick it clean in a matter of hours. So to prevent the ducks from getting under it, they do all the mussel aquaculture in Maine is under a raft, floating dock essentially. So the lines are actually underneath the docks, and the birds can't get under there, so it's protected from the birds. We don't have that problem in Massachusetts, so we can just set up our long lines, and they don't seem to have that problem up in the Canadian Maritimes either. They just have the lines out basically just below the surface of the water, so generally it's 10 to 15 feet or 5 meters underwater, and they're suspended off the bottom, and it's essentially a giant clothesline. And a commercial setup of this is 400 to 600 foot line, and every 3 feet you have a 15 to 25 foot line of mussels. And just like the clams, you start with the little seed mussels, and those you can get anywhere. So lots in Canada or coastally here, they just get them off the rocks and collect them at different times of year. So again, just like the clams, we tend to see the seed in the late summer months. You collect the seed and put it in basically a sock, and then you hang it on the clothesline and let it grow. In Massachusetts, we can get mussels to about that same 55, 60 millimeter size in like 10 months. So if we put them out in the fall, we can start harvesting them in the late summer again, and then you start seeding for the next summer. You can also hang seed lines off your long line and collect mussels that way, get seed that way. What we're finding in Massachusetts is that there's too much activity in too little coastal area. So unlike in Maine, where you have lots of coastal area, there's just too much activity and it's too concentrated an area down in Massachusetts to do this coastally. So for the last few years, we've been trying to get a permit to do this offshore in federal waters. So that's 3 miles out of the state boundary in deeper federal waters. And this is pictures of us hauling the lines. And this is what a grow line looks like. So these are near harvest size mussels, right? It's probably about 2 to 3 feet thick, all right? And this technology is designed to be done by a boat. So just like a lobster lobster boat pulling their trawl line, you kind of pull this line up, and you got, instead of your lobster traps hanging off your line, you got these mussel lines that you bring in and harvest. Since we're doing research on these, we'll go in the water and measure growth rates and things like that while we're doing the research. So our coastal lines are primarily for research at this point, and also working with the technology, see what methods work best in our waters. When we go offshore, we have to be 50 feet underwater for that head rope on that mussels. And that's for just large ship traffic. So the Coast Guard is requiring us to be in deeper water. And what we're looking at is trying to get a commercial size farm, which is roughly 33 acres, somewhere around 30, 35 acres is a typical commercial mussel farm. And this would be fully submerged, so it wouldn't be anywhere near the surface. So as I said, it's got to be at least 50 feet underwater. And our site that we picked is 8.5 miles off Cape Ann, or the point of Rockport, Massachusetts. And it's in federal waters, so we need to be permitted for that. And this full-scale farm would be 60, 300 foot, actually we've modified it a little, it's going to be 40, 400 foot lines in a 2x2 array. And we've been trying we're trying for the last 2 years to get this permitted, and we're going through the various permitting process. We will probably have a permit sometime in the next couple of months. We're right at the last stages of having our permit issued. There's another mussel farm in federal waters that is part of our project. It's our Site B that's down off the Cape, near the big Cape Wind farm site that's being, or proposed to be established. And they just got their permit, and both of us anticipate getting started, hopefully by next year, get our gear in the water. This has never been done in federal water, so both of these projects will be the first in the country. So we have to go through a whole research and development phase. So we're gonna set stuff out. We don't even know how well they're gonna grow out there, right? They certainly will grow fine in coastal waters. A lot of plankton for them to grow, just like the clams, they need the plankton. Also add that depth. I mean, it looks like it should be good, but a lot of this initially will be experimental. But the goal is to be able to come up with a plan for commercial mussel farming offshore. How many more slides we got? This is just a site of where the mussel farm site is. And it's actually, this is the edge of Stellwagen Sanctuary, so we're just outside Stellwagen. Oh, the offshore sites actually has a closed area for paralytic shellfish, but there's protocols in place for us to get around that. We can actually we would test the mussels out in the ocean, on the boat, and then bring them back in and they get tested again. And this is for red tide, paralytic shellfish poisoning. That's the end, okay.
This is where we're heading to for the next couple months. This is when we get to be quiet. But I think one point that we would like to make, and I'll actually give you an invitation as well, a lot of the things we want to do, whether it be with green crabs or with eelgrass, they are fairly simple projects. You need a little bit of background training. It is something that you don't need a lot of fancy equipment. And we have people that we send out. I have my own students who I can encourage or otherwise, encourage, we'll leave it at that, to go out. Grades and so forth are always a nice thing to have available for incentive. But a lot of these things are throughout New England, and certainly coming up from Massachusetts up here into Maine. And if there's any interest here for some of the survey work that we'd like to do, we would certainly be happy to see if we could come up with some kind of cooperative interaction. Most of what we do is walking outside. Particularly, we can use a lot of work this time of year going into the winter. Maine people, you're all nice and hardy. I know when I go on the boat, I have tons of students who want to come out with me in July. I have fewer who come out in February for some unknown reason. But these are kind of things we do. Simple projects, all coastal waters. Like here, our school is primarily all undergraduates. So these are not fancy graduate research projects or anything like that. And there's a lot out there we don't know. We have a lot of questions. And fortunately, a lot of them are fairly simple based questions. So we can come up with some really interesting studies. And perhaps we'll see some of you. Thank you for your time.
Any questions?
Any questions?
Has the increased ocean acidity affected the growth of the mussels or
We have actually had a project going on in Boston Harbor, and it does seem to affect some of the clams in the really shallow harbor area where you've got not only shallow water, a lot of sand flats and so forth. We've noticed that some of the shells are thinner than they would normally be given the size of the clam, but we haven't actually seen any effect on actual growth rates yet. So certainly something that we actually have a couple of students who are doing an ongoing project looking at that. But I could certainly see where it would affect calcium carbonate disposition, that would affect shell development and could be a real issue.
Yeah, familiar before is when they're really small, it's when they're kind of developing, that's when these can't develop it well and they just deteriorate. But
Yeah, a lot of those studies they're subjecting them to really higher concentrations than what you're really seeing. And it depends on the area, because you get with flushing, and so obviously if the water heats up and there's not a lot of flushing, then they're gonna have problems. There's a lot of people beginning to study this. We have, with our mussel project, because the mussels are perfect, Mussel Watch is another international thing where groups go out and collect mussels, and they do all kinds of basically pollutant studies initially, but now they're using them for the effects of global warming and ocean acidification. So there's a number of groups certainly looking at that as well. Yeah.
Did you mention you have internship possibilities?
We do. Cat Cove is almost all student-run. I have students who work in the summer, and that's when we do all of our projects, which is kind of nice because that's when students generally have some free time. So, you know,
It's also the big clam growth.
it's when all of our creatures happen to be out and doing stuff as well. So, yes, I certainly, we could certainly talk internship possibilities. So,
Thank you very much.
thank you.